Most people expect rejection the moment they come out. David expected silence, maybe shame. But what he got, at least at first, was something closer to love. At 19, he sat across the kitchen table from his parents in the same small Ohio house he grew up in. The walls still smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, and his mother was wearing her usual blue sweater, the one with the threadbare elbows. He braced himself to be disowned. Instead, his father nodded once quietly, and his mother reached out, placed her hand gently on top of his. "You're still our boy," she said. That was all. It didn't fix the fear. It didn't make the world safer. But it gave David something solid to hold on to when everything else around him felt fragile. His 3 older siblings, however, barely reacted. They stood in the hallway that evening, arms crossed, eyes avoiding his. No open anger, just cold distance. Like a wall had gone up they had no intention of taking down. But David didn't need them, or at least he told himself that. He focused on the love that mattered, the kind that made Sunday dinners warm and quiet trips to the doctor less lonely. After college, David moved to New York but called home every Friday. He mailed birthday cards. He flew back every Thanksgiving, even when work was overwhelming. His mom always kept his favorite dessert in the fridge, and his dad, by then needing help to get around, would smile when David helped him tie his shoes. They never talked much about his personal life. They never said the word gay out loud. But there was care in their silence, and that was enough. The house remained a place of memory, with creaking stairs and fading wallpaper and the humming of an old refrigerator that seemed to have outlived everything. In that house, David could be small again, not invisible. He brought flowers to his mom's garden, helped his dad fix the leaky sink, and once even baked a pie from scratch just to hear his mom laugh when he burned the crust. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For a time, David let himself believe that was all he needed, 2 people who didn't turn their backs. His siblings rarely visited. When they did, it felt performative. They brought expensive wine, spoke loudly about their jobs, barely acknowledged him. At one Christmas, his brother called him the artsy one with a laugh that didn't quite land. But David brushed it off. He had love and presence and years of quiet loyalty to offer. He never asked to be the favorite. He just wanted to be part of the picture. When his mother got sick, David flew home without hesitation. For months, he helped with her treatments, drove her to appointments, sat beside her through the long, heavy silences that illness brings. His siblings called in once or twice, sent flowers, but they weren't there when her hands trembled too much to hold a cup. David was. He stayed until the very end, holding her hand while she whispered, "You're still my boy." And then the center of everything was gone. Grief arrived quietly, not like a storm, but like a fog. David stayed a few more days to help his father, to organize the funeral, to make sure someone would check in on him. His siblings showed up the day of the service, all in black, standing together on the front pew like a wall. David wasn't invited to speak. He stood beside the casket, said goodbye in silence, and drove back to New York with a hollow chest. He didn't know it then, but this would be the last time he was welcomed home. If you've ever loved without being truly seen, or held a family together with silence and hope, stay with this story. Because David's journey is just beginning, and what comes next will test everything he believed about love, loss, and what it means to be chosen or erased. Grief changes people, but not always in the way you'd hope. After the funeral, David lingered for 3 more days in the old house. His father's gait was slower than ever, and the silence stretched between them like an old blanket, worn but familiar. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the maple tree in the backyard, David handed his father a glass of water. The old man took it with shaking hands and said, without looking up, "You were the one who stayed." That was the last full sentence David would ever hear from him. The next 2 years passed in a kind of suspended reality. David returned to New York, to his small apartment in long shifts, in the predictable rhythms of a life that was, for better or worse, fully his own. He called home once a week, but the calls were rarely answered. Sometimes his father picked up, said a few words, then hung up quickly. His siblings never returned texts or emails. David didn't push. He told himself this was just how families fell apart, quietly. Like wallpaper peeling in the corners until the whole room changed and you didn't even notice until it was bare. When the hospital called, it wasn't a surprise. His father had been admitted a few days prior. Complications, breathing problems. They didn't say much and they didn't need to. David took the next flight home, but when he arrived at the hospital, something was wrong. His name wasn't listed as next of kin. He wasn't on the visitor list. It took arguing with a nurse, showing old photos on his phone, calling in a favor from his mother's friend who still worked at the front desk, before he was let through. And when he finally entered the room, his father was barely conscious. A thin oxygen tube looped over his ears. His skin looked like wax, paper thin and already half vanished. David sat beside him and held his hand for hours. At one point, the old man opened his eyes for just a moment. His lips barely moved. David leaned in. "I'm proud of you," his father whispered. And then he was gone. The funeral was closed casket. Private, his siblings said. Immediate family only. David learned about it 3 days later from the local obituary column. His name wasn't mentioned. There were no photos of him. No acknowledgments of his years of care. No mention of the son who was always there when no one else was. He went anyway. He stood at the edge of the cemetery during the service, far enough to not be noticed, but close enough to see his siblings dressed in black, standing in a perfect line like statues. The wind was sharp that day. He watched the casket lower. No one turned around. Not once. Afterward, he drove past the old family house one last time. The curtains were closed. The yard looked trimmed, clean. There were new flowers by the mailbox, but not the kind his mother would have chosen. She had loved daisies. These were all tulips. A week later, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It came from a lawyer in Columbus. The will had been executed. Assets divided. No mention of David, no belongings, no heirlooms, nothing. Not even the faded photo of him and his mom baking cookies, the one that used to hang in the hallway. The lawyer wrote plainly, "Your siblings have decided to retain all personal property and have not requested your involvement." He read the letter 3 times, folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. For weeks after that, David tried to make sense of the erasure. He wasn't angry, at least, not in the way he thought he'd be. It was more like being erased from a story you helped write. He thought about all the birthdays remembered, the flights home, the nights he stayed beside a hospital bed while the others stayed silent. And for what? Even the digital traces vanished. Family photos posted online with cropped edges. Family events where he simply didn't exist. One cousin asked, months later, "Hey, how's Chicago?" David just smiled. He had never lived in Chicago. One day, a neighbor from his old block messaged him. It was a short note. "I was shocked to hear about your passing. You were always so kind. I hope wherever you are, you're at peace." David sat in silence for a long time. Then he replied, "I'm very much alive, just not in their story." Time has a strange way of softening pain, just enough to live with it, but never quite enough to forget. After his father's death and the silent exile that followed, David returned to New York and quietly rewrote his life. Not with drama or grand reinvention, just with deliberate, quiet choice. He got a smaller apartment closer to the bakery where he worked. He stopped checking social media for family updates. He started bringing home fresh lavender every Saturday morning, a tradition his mother once loved. Little by little, he built something resembling peace. There were no more calls, no letters, no apologies. For years, he lived in a kind of ghost state, known to friends, loved by a partner, respected at work, but always just slightly detached from the idea of belonging. Because deep down, some part of him still waited, not for reconciliation, but for explanation. For someone to say out loud what had been said only through absence. "You are not one of us. You were never supposed to be." But no one ever said it. They just lived it and expected him to absorb the weight of it quietly. David learned to stop asking questions. He baked. He loved. He read. He walked the city like it owed him nothing and still offered everything. Sometimes he'd pause outside churches on cold evenings, looking at the soft glow through stained glass, not to pray, but to wonder what it meant to be chosen by something or someone. He had stopped believing in divine fairness a long time ago. Every now and then, someone from the past resurfaced. A childhood friend messaged him after seeing a photo online. "Hey, I didn't know you were gay. That's so cool." An old teacher found him at a book signing told him she was proud. A distant cousin reached out once, asking him if the rumors were true. Did they really cut you off because of that? David never answered, not because he couldn't, but because the truth, when spoken out loud, somehow made it smaller, too clean, too explainable. What happened wasn't just because he was gay. It was because they could, because silence is easier than honesty, because exclusion requires no courage, only the absence of love. 15 years passed, long enough for his hair to gray slightly at the temples, long enough for the bakery to expand and name him lead recipe developer, long enough for him to say we instead of I when speaking about the man who shared his apartment, his life, and his quiet mornings. The hurt didn't disappear, it just took on a new shape, like a scar grown familiar. And then, on a Tuesday like any other, the silence broke. It came not with thunder, but with a voicemail. The number was unfamiliar. The voice was not. It was his oldest sister. David, I know this is a lot. I don't know what to say. It's Matthew. He's sick. Stage 4, it's bad. There's no one else. I don't know who to call. I didn't think you'd even pick up. Please, if you can help. David didn't move. The phone stayed in his hand long after the message ended. He played it again and again. There was no apology, no we were wrong, just a statement of need, and beneath it, something bitter, not regret, but panic. He set the phone down and walked to the window. Outside, people passed by in their Tuesday pace coffee in hand, eyes half awake. Life continued, always did. His partner, Mark, entered the room carrying 2 mugs. Everything okay? David nodded slowly. That was my sister. Mark said nothing, just set a mug down beside him. David didn't cry, he didn't rage. He just stared out into the gray and whispered something only he could hear. Now you remember me. David didn't answer right away. He let the message sit untouched, unreturned. For hours, then days. It wasn't spite, it wasn't anger, not in the way most people would expect. It was something more difficult. A reckoning. Because what do you do when the people who shut the door on your life suddenly knock not with apology, but with expectation? What do you owe to those who once decided you were nothing? For a long time, David sat with that question. And when he finally answered, it wasn't a call, it was an email. Simple, clear. I'm available to speak on Thursday. Please send full medical details and care logistics in advance. The reply came within the hour. His brother Matthew was in a palliative care unit upstate. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. The family, his 2 sisters, had been rotating visits, but work and distance and unspoken guilt had made things difficult. The doctor said it was a matter of weeks, maybe less. They needed someone consistent, someone capable, someone who had shown once upon a time that he knew how to stay when others left. David booked a train, not because he felt he had to, but because he needed to see it for himself, to face the physical proof that time had done what rejection could not, soften even the sharpest cruelty. When he arrived at the hospital, the nurse at the front desk looked up and asked for ID. David offered it wordlessly. She glanced at the screen, smiled gently. You're listed as his primary contact now. That surprised him, not because they had named him, but because it was the first time in 15 years anyone in that family had chosen to put his name on anything. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and fading flowers. Room 412 was quiet. When David stepped in, Matthew was asleep, or sedated. His body had thinned to almost nothing. Skin loose over bone, breath shallow. A small tray sat untouched beside the bed. On the windowsill, a single wilted tulip white, already graying at the edges. David stood there for a long moment. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just reached into his bag and pulled out a document, 2 pages, printed on clean letterhead. At the top, care agreement and boundaries. It wasn't legal, just personal. He placed it on the bedside table. The terms were clear. David would oversee palliative arrangements. Medical decisions would be handled in coordination with staff. He would not engage in family gatherings, group chats, or emotional interventions. He would not respond to calls outside of clinical updates. And when the time came, he would handle the end not as a brother, but as a man who once learned what care meant in the absence of recognition. That night, his sister called. "Did you go?" she asked. David answered, "Yes," she hesitated. "You don't have to do this, you know." He paused, then said, "I'm not doing this for you or for him." There was silence on the line. Then she said quietly, "But you came anyway." "Yes," David said, "I did." In the days that followed, David returned to the hospital daily. He brought fresh socks, lotion for dry skin, a speaker to play soft piano music. He never once called Matthew brother, never once stayed longer than necessary, but he was there. Matthew regained consciousness once, looked at David with hollowed eyes, no speech, just presence. And in that moment, David didn't feel satisfaction or revenge. He felt something stranger, detachment, a quiet knowing that he had become everything they once believed he couldn't be, resilient, grounded, reliable. Not in spite of who he was, but because of it. The nurses whispered things when he passed. "He's been so attentive. He comes every day. They must be close." David never corrected them, let them assume what they wanted. He wasn't there to rewrite the family story. He was there to end his part in it with clarity. On the seventh night, as Matthew slept in stillness that looked more like leaving than resting, David stood beside the window and wrote a single sentence in his journal. "Sometimes the ones who abandon you are the ones who taught you how to never walk away." Matthew passed just after sunrise. The nurse called at 6:12 a.m., voice steady but soft, as if already bracing for a wave of grief that never came. David stood in his kitchen, still in pajamas, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. He listened to the words, peacefully, "No pain. You were the last listed contact," and thanked her quietly. Then he sat down at the table and stared at the steam rising from the cup. He didn't cry. There was no release, no collapse. Just a slow, aching exhale. Later that morning, the hospital asked if he wanted to arrange the cremation or pass the responsibility on. David chose to handle it himself, not out of sentiment, but because some doors, once opened, should be closed with care. He scheduled the cremation, signed the papers, paid the bill. No one else called, not the sisters who had begged him to come, not the nieces and nephews he'd never met. Not one word from the family that had once erased him like a typo in their narrative. It was almost poetic. He had returned for them, and still they could not return for him. That evening he went home and baked. It was an old recipe one his mother used to make in the winter, with nutmeg and brown sugar folded into thick buttery dough. He hadn't touched it in over a decade, but something about the way grief moves through a room made him reach for what had once been his anchor. The kitchen filled with warmth. Mark, his partner, walked in and said nothing, just wrapped his arms around David from behind and rested his chin on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he whispered. "No," David replied quietly. "I did what I chose to do." That night, they ate the pie by candlelight, not in mourning but in stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes after you've returned to a place that no longer holds you and left it without bitterness. A week later, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, no return address, inside a single page. His sister's handwriting, still sharp. "We don't understand how you could be so cold. After everything. You didn't even try to reconnect. You just showed up, made decisions, and disappeared again. I hope you can live with that." David folded the letter once, then again, slid it into a drawer beside the old obituary, the empty birthday card he once received unsigned, and the worn family photo where he'd been carefully cropped out. He could live with it. In fact, he was finally learning how to live fully. A month later, he launched a small online baking channel, Recipes for the Uninvited, a quiet corner of the internet where queer kids could learn how to make bread, pies, and resilience from scratch. Every video ended the same way, with a candle lit in memory of those who once made us feel at home, and a reminder that chosen family isn't second best. It's a decision, a declaration. David never spoke publicly about his siblings again, not out of shame, but because some people don't get to write your ending, because forgiveness doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it's a quiet act of dignity, a boundary kept, a plate baked in peace. Have you ever had to choose yourself over the people who were supposed to choose you? Tell us your story in the comments, because your voice matters here. And if this story stayed with you, share it. There's someone out there who needs to know they're not alone. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories of courage, healing, and truth. told exactly as they happened or as they could have.